Of the many great COVID-19 controversies, perhaps the greatest is the efficacy, or lack, of the drug hydroxychloroquine on the virus. And as my new channel grows and more people watch, more people have conflicting views on subjects like this, the more time I waste arguing in the comments. It reached a head a couple of weeks ago and I realised it is fruitless, and creating videos explaining these situations would be a better way forward. So, on to the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, which from now on I'll shorten to HCQ. We'll start with a little history lesson, going back to February 2016. And this research paper, Coronaviruses, Drug Discovery and Therapeutic Options. Now I'm simply going to search for the term chloroquine, as that is the drug that HCQ is based on. So chloroquine is an anti-malarial drug, which has broad-spectrum antiviral activities against numerous coronaviruses listed here, and other RNA viruses in vitro. Now these numbers afterwards link to 6 studies supporting this claim. So we can be pretty confident that chloroquine works to inhibit coronavirus-infected monkey liver cells in a petri dish. Petri dishes are a bit different to bodies, however, and chloroquine did not substantially reduce viral replication in SARS-CoV infected mice. So that's an important early distinction to make. Just because something works in a lab doesn't mean that it will work in nature. Now moving forward to February last year, just after SARS-CoV-2 burst onto the scene, and this Chinese study discovered that remdesivir and chloroquine effectively inhibit the recently emerged novel coronavirus 2019 nCoV or SARS-CoV-2 in vitro. The study notes that several drugs such as ribavirin, interferon, lopinavir, ritonavir, and corticosteroids have been used in patients with SARS and MERS, although the efficacy of some drugs remains controversial. But their study concluded with, "Our findings reveal that remdesivir and chloroquine are highly effective in the control of 2019 nCoV infection in vitro." And they suggest that both drugs should be assessed in human patients suffering from the novel coronavirus disease. And then 5 weeks later, this excellent Chinese study discovered that a spin-off product from chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, was found to be even more potent than chloroquine in inhibiting SARS-CoV-2 in vitro. What was interesting in this one was, the drug was also tried as a pre-treatment. That is, the hydroxychloroquine was administered to the cells before the virus was, and it exhibited a superior in vitro antiviral effect in comparison to chloroquine. And so to summarise, all these early studies of the drug, hydroxychloroquine was found to be effective in animal cells under lab conditions, and every one of these studies suggested that proper clinical trials on humans were needed. Now when it comes to clinical trials, there are 2 basic types, observational and experimental. In an observational study, the scientists observe and gather data on their subjects. In the case of, say, HCQ, they would compare the health outcomes of those who had COVID and were administered the drug versus those who had COVID and weren't. But that would be the limit of their action. There is no attempt to influence anything here. In an experimental study, the scientists intervene directly. They would usually start by randomizing the subjects into 2 or more groups. In the case of HCQ again, one of the groups would be administered the drug, while the other would get a placebo instead. And that's known as a blind study, because the subjects don't know if they got the real treatment or if they got the placebo. And taking it further, an experimental study can also be double-blind. In a double-blind experiment, neither the subjects or the scientists know who gets what. So in the case of observational, the scientists know everything about the subjects beforehand, and the subjects themselves may know which drugs they were administered. And so this opens observational studies to certain biases, making them a bit less valid. The scientists could end up grouping people in a way that made their desired result more likely. If a scientist had a certain bias towards finding a certain result, the way they question their subjects can affect the study too. And the subjects themselves can end up being biased simply because they knew they were given treatment, and they convinced themselves that it worked, which is the point of the placebo. This is why there is a gold standard for clinical studies, known as the Randomized Controlled Trial, or RCT, preferably double-blind. If the groups are properly randomized, then selection biases are very unlikely, especially when the numbers are large, say over 1,000 people in each group. So clearly, the RCT is a far more reliable study than an observational one, is open to multiple biases. Why aren't all clinical trials RCT then? In a perfect world they would be, but in some cases it's just not possible, perhaps due to time or cost, but there are also ethical concerns. We wouldn't not vaccinate one group of kids against malaria in a trial, for example, just to see if the vaccine worked. So, with that discussed, let's have a look at the human studies and much of the reason for the controversy over HCQ. The first human study, and the one which caused so much drama, with at the time, President Trump tweeting about it being a game changer, was this small study in Marseille, France, hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin as a treatment of COVID-19, results of an open-label, non-randomised clinical trial. HCQ we know about. Azithromycin, which from now on will be shortened to AZM, is an antibiotic widely used in the treatment of chest infections such as pneumonia, sinusitis, skin infections, Lyme disease, and some STDs. Now, open label is basically the opposite of blind, with all participants and scientists having full knowledge of the drugs being administered to whom. And here is the entire study. So moving on to the background. As we know, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine have been found to be efficient on SARS-CoV-2, in vitro at least, and this study will evaluate the role of HCQ on respiratory viral loads. Now, under patients and methods, we see that confirmed COVID-19 patients were included in a single-arm protocol. And single-arm means that everyone in the study was given the same treatment, 600 milligrams HCQ daily, with their viral load being swab tested daily in a hospital setting. And depending on their clinical presentation, azithromycin was added to the treatment. So not everyone got AZM. It started to get a little bit weird here though, when noting that untreated patients from another centre and also cases refusing the protocol were included as negative controls. I'll get to that in a bit, but the outcome of the study will depend purely on the presence or absence of the virus at a day 6 endpoint. So in other words, a bunch of COVID patients will be given HCQ. Some of them will also be given AZM. They will all be PCR tested daily, and if they don't have the virus on day 6, they will be considered cured. That's the test patients. And the results were that 20 cases were treated in this study. That is, 20 cases given HCQ or AZM, and they showed a significant reduction in the viral carriage on day 6. In other words, they were basically tested negative for SARS-CoV-2 on the 6th day after being treated. When AZM was added to HCQ, it was significantly more efficient for getting rid of the virus. The conclusion being that hydroxychloroquine is significantly associated with viral load reduction / disappearance in COVID-19 patients, and its effect is reinforced by azithromycin. Now, having a large sample of subjects is very important, as the more people you have to study, the less confounding factors there can be in the results. You're far more likely to get random factors heavily skewing the results in a 36-person study like this one, than compared to, say, a 1,000-person study. And as we look deeper into the study, we begin to find a few glaring issues with it. Remember I said that this was a single-arm study, meaning that everyone gets the same treatment. But if everybody gets the same treatment, how do you know if it works? Well, in this case, the controls, the group that wasn't treated, were recruited in Marseille, Nice, Avignon, and Briançon centres, all located in southern France. So the second group, the control group, came from 4 different centres. Now that is not fantastic methodology, as it adds a random element of test quality. And there were 2 primary test criteria. Everyone had to be over 12 years of age and had to have tested positive by PCR for SARS-CoV-2 in a nasal swab when admitted to the hospital. And like I said, 36 people took part. And here is where the study takes a bizarre turn, as the study notes that a total of 26 patients received hydroxychloroquine and 16 were control patients. Now, 26 and 16 is 42, as you can see here. However, 6 hydroxychloroquine treated patients were lost in follow-up during the survey because of early cessation of treatment. And the reasons given were 3 patients were transferred to the intensive care unit, including one who was transferred to the ICU on the 2nd day, who was PCR positive on day 1, another who was transferred to the ICU on day 3, who was PCR positive on days 1 and 2, and another who was transferred to the ICU on day 4, who was PCR positive on days 1 and 3. So that's 3 HCQ patients transferred to the ICU while positive who were not included in the study. Next up, 1 patient died on the 3rd day, but they were PCR negative, which to me kind of points to a false negative. The 5th patient decided to leave the hospital on the 3rd day because they were PCR negative on days 1 and 2. As it turns out, they never actually had the virus. And finally, the last patient, patient 6, stopped the treatment on day 3 because the hydroxychloroquine was giving him nausea. He was PCR positive on day 1, 2 and 3. So that was 6 people in the hydroxychloroquine group who were removed from the study for reasons including 3 in intensive care, 1 who died, and 1 who stopped the treatment due to side effects. In total, 4 of the 6 were positive for the virus at the time, not including the 1 who died, who clearly had the virus, and as it turned out, the person who left the study never actually had it. Scrolling down a bit and we see that one of the patients under HCQ and AZM combination, who tested negative on day 6, then tested positive at low titer on day 8. So that could have been another false negative result counted in favour of the HCQ and AZM group. So in total, 5 people who would very likely have been PCR positive on day 6 were removed from the study, and one that was counted as negative was probably positive instead. Now, let's have a look at the results in more detail, and also the claims. You can see here, day 3, day 4, day 5 and day 6 post-inclusion to the study. The hydrochloroquine treated patients, that's anyone who got HCQ at all, including the ones in the AZM and HCQ groups. On day 3, 10 of 20 were cured. On day 4, 12 of 20 were cured. On day 5, 13 of 20. And on day 6, 14 of 20, or 70% of all the subjects who got HCQ were cured of SARS-CoV-2. And looking at the untreated control patients, 1 of 16, 4 of 16, 3 of 16, 2 of 16. So more people were cured on day 4 compared to day 6. Kinda points to a problem in testing. And also remember that had they not removed those people in intensive care and the one that died and the one that had to drop out due to nausea, this claim of 70% negative tests, 14 of 20, it's more like 14 out of 25, 56% instead of 70%. Now on the next table, the split between HCQ only and HCQ and AZM, which in fact is a little bit weird in itself, as we see now that only 8 of 14 HCQ only patients were treated, which in actual fact should have been 8 out of 19. But concentrating now on the HCQ and AZM combined treatment, 5 of 6 on day 3, 5 of 6 on day 4, 6 of 6 on day 5, and 6 of 6 people were cured by the end of day 6 for a 100% cure rate. If you forget about the one that retested positive on day 8, that is. But it was this next table where things got really interesting. Supplementary Table 1, which shows all patients and all the results. Now, patients 1 to 16 were the control group, so they received no treatment whatsoever. Patients 17 to 30 were the hydroxychloroquine only group, and patients 31 to 36 were the HCQ and AZM group. Now, starting off with the top 16, and towards the right of the chart, we see D0 to D6, which is day 0 to day 6 PCR tests. These numbers here, 31, 26, 26, 24, etc., are the CT value of the test, which I explained in my video here, the truth about PCR testing. So feel free to watch that if you need a primer. But in short, this number here can be used to ascertain the amount of virus in a person's sample. And the higher the number, it means that there is less virus present. And looking down this list, we can see something which should be immediately apparent. Remember the differences in testing centres that I was concerned about? Well, it does seem that my fear of random test quality came true. As some of these tests clearly did not do RT-PCR, it appears that they have instead done what is called qualitative PCR. And with qualitative PCR, the machine can only say if the virus is present or not when the run is finished. It cannot tell you how much. And so, in all these positives here, we have got no way of knowing how much virus was in this sample at any stage of the test. So why is that important? Well, we can see here down at the bottom, what's considered a negative PCR result, all these negatives here, is when the CT value was greater than 35. And as I've shown in previous videos, most PCR machines will run PCR up to 40 cycles, and some even up to 45 cycles. And so we simply have no way to know if all these positives at the end of day 6 would have been counted positive or negative had they used the RT-PCR. There is simply no way to tell. All these numbers here could be 40 plus. In other words, negative by the rest of the test. Now you might think that's bad enough, but it gets a lot worse. ND means the PCR test was not done. In 5 of the control group, 5 of these bottom 6 here, there was no PCR test done on the 6th day. And 2 of them weren't even tested on the 5th or the 6th day. Remember how the results were compared. It's all about this day 6 testing positive or negative. And in the control group, only 2 of 16, 12.5%, were said to be negative. But 5 of them weren't even tested in the final day. These people were considered positive even though they weren't tested. And here is a major lesson in what makes a study good or bad. Let's just say that half of these positives and half of these not dones were in fact actually negative by this same criteria of CT value greater than 35. That would now mean that 7 out of 16, or 44% of the tests, would have been negative, which is pretty similar to these HCQ numbers. And all of a sudden, they've got a situation where the difference between these would not be considered statistically significant in such a low population study. Alright, fair enough, but what about the HCQ and AZM group? 6 out of 6 cured after 6 days. Surely that is amazing. Well, no, not really. If you look at all this day 0 PCR data, we can see that many in the hydroxychloroquine only group had a pretty low CT. There's a 15, there's a 17, there's a 19, and there's a couple of 22s. The lowest in the HCQ AZM group was 23, and most of them were quite a bit higher than that. Remember, the lower the CT number, the more virus in the sample. And also remember that this was an open-label, non-randomized study where the scientists could have chosen to give the HCQ and AZM combo to any of these people. And over at PubPeer, which is a site where the public can peer review papers, and they did a very good job on this one, I can assure you, I found this excellent graph showing the results for what they really were. Those people that started out with a lower PCR, in other words, having more virus in their sample, they tended to take longer to be cured. As you can see, the day of the last positive test, people who had like a 15 or a 17 or a 19 CT value, it took them longer to test negative. But all of those who had a CT value of 23 plus, well, we can see them all here, all grouped together. The red dots being the HCQ and AZM group, and the blue triangles being the hydroxychloroquine only group. When these minimum CT values were similar, there was no obvious difference in how fast they were cured. The 7 highest CT hydroxychloroquine only group performed just as well, if not better, than the HCQ and AZM group, if you just look at their minimum CT values. This miracle cure is nothing of the sort, and it is clearly shown by their own data. This here is better known as natural progression of virus. And I'm just going to skip the fact that they've added 2 10-year-olds to the control group, even though they said 12 was supposed to be the minimum age. And in fact, I am now done with the data here. Although believe me, I could have continued to point out even more problems if I had the time. Now, I know many of you love a good conspiracy theory. However, you generally believe it's the opposite of what the actual conspiracy is. So to finish with this part, let's have a look at any potential conflicts of interest in this study. The article was published at various places, including PubMed. And clicking on affiliations here, expand, we can see this IHU Mediterranean Infection, Marseille, France, multiple times. And in fact, this is where the study took place. And a partner of Mediterranean Infection, please excuse my French, is Sanofi Aventis, as we can see here, under partners. And down here at the bottom left again, now they've got a lot of partners. And with this one, we can see that they have sponsored past research for this university hospital. Now, I wonder what Sanofi do. French pharmaceutical Sanofi offers anti-malaria treatment for COVID-19 after promising trials. Sanofi said it was ready to offer France millions of doses of Plaquenil, which is their brand name of hydroxychloroquine. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that they also offer azithromycin. But it is up to you if you want to make a conspiracy out of that. I'm simply bringing it to your attention. And so this is why double-blind randomized control trials are so important. This study is worthless. Says who? Well, it wasn't Trump at least. He said it was a very good test. A couple of weeks later though, and the publisher of the paper said that it didn't meet its standards. And he wasn't the only one, with other scientists chiming in with, the study was a complete failure and it was pathetic. And this single paper kicked off this whole hydroxychloroquine thing. A completely unproven drug for COVID. A tiny 36-person, non-randomised, open-label study where the flaws outnumbered the good practices. A study where 3 people taking the drug required intensive care and another one died. But those results were not considered part of the test. Nobody in the control group died or needed intensive care. This study could have been titled 4 people taking hydroxychloroquine died. And to be blunt, it would have been just as worthless. Since that study, though, there have been multiple randomised and non-randomised controlled trials. But outside of this very small, early, non-peer-reviewed Chinese study, they have all come up with the same result. After high risk or moderate risk exposure to COVID-19, hydroxychloroquine did not prevent illness compatible with COVID-19 or confirmed infection when used as a post-exposure prophylaxis within 4 days after exposure. This is one for the people who say it needs to be used early. It was tested, it didn't work. In another one, hydroxychloroquine for early treatment of adults with mild coronavirus disease, a randomised controlled trial concluded that in patients with mild COVID-19, no benefit was observed with HCQ beyond the usual care. HCQ with or without AZM in mild to moderate COVID-19. Among patients hospitalised with mild to moderate COVID-19, the use of HCQ alone or with AZM did not improve clinical status at 15 days as compared with standard care. Perhaps the most important one though, so far at least, was the recovery trial, which tested over 4,500 people, with their data convincingly ruling out any meaningful mortality benefit of hydroxychloroquine in patients hospitalised with COVID-19. And an increasing number of randomised trials around May and June showing no efficacy was swiftly followed by the FDA revoking the emergency use authorisation for the drug, which they had authorised after the French study. And that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Not in America, at least. With this study published on the 1st of July 2020, treatment with hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin and combination in patients hospitalised with COVID-19, the Henry Ford Health System rekindled the controversy with their discovery that among hospitalised patients, use of HCQ alone and in combination with AZM was associated with a significant reduction in hospital mortality compared to not receiving HCQ. And looking at the results of their 2,541 patient study, which was a multi-centre, retrospective, non-randomised, non-blind study. So it's an analysis of the data from past patients, not a randomised controlled trial. The overall in-hospital mortality was 18.1%. By treatment, 20.1% of those who received HCQ and AZM died. Only 13.5% who received hydroxychloroquine alone died. 22.4% of those who received azithromycin alone died. And 26.4% who received neither drug died during the test. Now, 26.4% compared to 13.5% for HCQ alone, that is almost a 50% reduction in mortality from the use of hydroxychloroquine alone, which is massive and points to a clear benefit from the drug. And even though it was a retrospective observational study, it has multiple benefits over the French study. For starters, the primary outcome was in-hospital mortality, which is obviously far more easy to observe and record than a PCR test, which may or may not have been taken at a different venue. Treatments were protocol-driven and uniform in all hospitals, and all the data and variables were detailed in this paragraph. So we know what steps were taken before the results were modelled and analysed. And below the results we can see all these details in a couple of tables, including the patient's age, their race, and comorbidities like chronic lung disease, etc. All of which we know have a major effect on COVID-19 mortality. And down at the bottom we can see what other treatment they were given on top of the HCQ or AZM. And at a quick glance, everything appears to be legit and in order. So where does that leave us? Less than a month previously, the recovery trial in the UK This is a randomized controlled trial with 4,500 patients. They found no benefit for hydroxychloroquine. And what's important to note here is that the Henry Ford study found that HCQ alone was the most beneficial. Some people will say it has to be given early to be beneficial, or it has to be taken alongside AZM. But the Henry Ford results clearly show that HCQ alone gave the largest benefit. President Trump didn't need any convincing, however, hitting Twitter with this tweet proclaiming victory and slamming the Dems for making it political. A few days later, the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, slammed Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying that he has been wrong about everything I have interacted with him on, while urging the FDA to once again approve HCQ for emergency use. And when pressed on the matter of the Henry Ford study at the end of July, Fauci had this to say.
So that study is a flawed study, and I think anyone who examines it carefully is that it is not a randomized placebo-controlled trial.
It said it was peer-reviewed.
It doesn't matter. You can peer-review something that's a bad study, but the fact is it is not a randomized placebo-controlled trial. The point that I think is important, because we all want to keep an open mind, any and all of the randomized placebo-controlled trials, which is the gold standard of determining if something is effective, none of them had shown any efficacy for hydroxychloroquine.
So clearly he believes that the randomized controlled studies are far more reliable. And in this video I've shown you why that usually is. But if the Henry Ford study was flawed, in which way was it flawed? Taking a closer look at the study data again, Table 1. We can see the total patients, those who got neither medication, those who got HCQ alone, those who got AZM alone, and those that got HCQ and AZM. The age of the non-treated group is definitely a bit higher. And we can also see that over 65 years old, 61% against 49% in the HCQ alone group. That is also quite a bit higher. And that could be a factor in mortality, as we know. But scrolling down a bit, we can see more black patients in the HCQ group. And we know that race is also a strong factor in mortality. The BMI of the HCQ group is also a fair bit higher than the untreated group. But perhaps most importantly, chronic lung disease prevalence in the hydroxychloroquine group, definitely that bit higher than the untreated group. Overall, you have to say, if anything, the HCQ group should have had more trouble beating the virus. And scrolling down a bit, more of the HCQ group were ever in intensive care compared to the untreated group. And even more were mechanically ventilated compared to the non-treated group. And then we get to the second last row, given steroid. 35.7% in the untreated group were given a steroid, while 78.9% of the HCQ group were. Furthermore, only 39% of the AZM group were, but 74.3% of the HCQ and AZM group were. And remember, when you're looking at the mortality, HCQ alone and HCQ and AZM performed better than AZM alone and those receiving neither treatment. Both of the best performing groups were given hydroxychloroquine, but far more were given the corticosteroid, methylprednisolone. Now, you may recall early in the video, right at the beginning, when earlier studies noted that several drugs such as ribavirin, interferon, lopinavir, ritonavir, and corticosteroids have been used in patients with SARS or MERS. And what's important to understand is that all of these swiftly underwent studies as well. It wasn't just hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, although those were the drugs that made most of the headlines, because those were the ones that were most heavily politicised. But it was no surprise when I found this study published on the 19th of May 2020, which was 6 weeks before the Henry Ford study was published. Early short-course corticosteroids in hospitalised patients with COVID-19, which conducted an experiment with a short course of methylprednisolone on 213 subjects, which concluded with an early short course of methylprednisolone in patients with moderate to severe COVID-19 reduced the escalation of care and improved clinical outcomes. And taking a look at the paper authors, show more. The Henry Ford COVID-19 Management Task Force. The same Henry Ford COVID-19 Task Force, which found the benefit with hydroxychloroquine. Now, to be completely transparent, in this earlier study of the corticosteroid, around 75% of all the patients were also administered hydroxychloroquine. So you might think, well, in that case, we're no further forward. But we do still have the much lower incidence in steroid administration in both the azithromycin and non-treated groups compared to the hydroxychloroquine group. Mortality in both the untreated and the AZM-only groups appeared to be much worse, due more to the lack of a steroid rather than the inclusion of hydroxychloroquine. And since that point, there have been various studies showing the efficacy with various corticosteroids, including this very large one by the recovery group again, that found a clear benefit. But as is the way of things, not all studies did. And so, is this the final word in this hydroxychloroquine story? Not quite. Because the French scientists were back with the results of a very large study on 3,737 COVID-19 patients treated with HCQ and AZM at the same hospital in Marseille, France. And this time, their methodology was vastly superior to their previous attempt, and it is actually a very impressive looking study, with all the data in place. The conclusion being, although this is a retrospective analysis, results suggest that early diagnosis, early isolation, and early treatment of COVID-19 patients with at least 3 days of HCQ-AZM lead to a significantly better clinical outcome and a faster viral load reduction than other treatments. My question to them would simply be though, why, when you had the chance to do a double-blind randomized controlled trial, did you opt for a retrospective analysis instead? With so many patients available, this was a great opportunity to put this to rest. As it is, it's just yet another open-label retrospective analysis which shows benefit, while all the randomized controlled trials show zero benefit. This one promises to rumble on and on, but has been a very large randomized study ongoing for a year, which will hopefully put the matter to rest. If this video only proved one thing, it's that science is very, very far from being infallible. Or more accurately, scientists are very, very far from being infallible. You should also be very careful with single small studies, especially when they aren't randomized or blinded. Simple fact here is, scientists are humans too, which means they are open to all sorts of biases and incentives to find the result that they, or maybe somebody else, wants them to find. I'll catch you later, guys.